He stood in front of the store, arms crossed, chin slightly lifted like he'd just conquered the world. The photo he posted was polished filters, perfect lighting, and a caption in bold, "I built this alone." My phone buzzed endlessly as the post went viral among our mutual friends and family. Their comments poured in, praising his drive, his independence, his grit. I stared at the screen in silence, my hands trembling, my chest tight. Because while the world was clapping for him, I was still paying off the second mortgage I took out to make that store a reality. I could still remember the day I signed the papers, walking out of the bank with a pit in my stomach and a trembling hope that it would all be worth it for us, not for him alone. But now, all I saw was a digital monument built on the back of my sacrifice, with my name erased. I didn't ask to be the center of attention. I never wanted the spotlight or the credit, but I did expect truth. I remembered the nights I sat at the kitchen table, crunching numbers with a calculator and tears in my eyes. The day he panicked about missing the first lease payment and I quietly sold my grandmother's jewelry to cover it. Not once did I bring it up to others, because that's what you do when you love someone, you show up. But now I was invisible. Disposable, just someone who once helped out, and apparently someone no longer even worth mentioning. I didn't respond publicly. I didn't comment or share, but something inside me shifted. It wasn't just the erasure, it was the ease with which he did it. As if rewriting the story to place himself at the center came naturally, as if I'd been nothing more than a spectator. I replayed moments in my mind like scenes from a movie. The day I gave him the folder with our first rough business plan, his hands shaking with excitement. The afternoon we argued for hours about shelving units until we finally laughed and chose the cheaper option together. None of that was in his post. There was no mention of the meals I skipped, so the down payment wouldn't bounce. No hint of the anxiety that kept me awake every night, wondering if this dream would crush us instead of carry us. It hurt not just because he lied, but because he didn't hesitate. That night, I walked past the storefront just to see it with my own eyes. The neon sign still flickered like it always did. Through the glass, I could see the counter I painted by hand, the display I built from recycled crates when money ran thin. He was inside, smiling with customers, thriving. I stood across the street and felt the cold wind cut through my coat. Not because I was jealous, but because I realized he had everything and I had nothing, not even the truth. And somehow, I'd let it happen. I'd handed over my savings, my time, and now, my story. And I started to ask myself quietly, when did support become silence? I went home and sat in the same chair I'd always used when we first planned it, all the one near the window where the light used to pour in at just the right angle. The house was quieter now, emptier, pieces of furniture gone, sold over the years to keep things afloat. I stared at the spot where our vision board used to hang. I'd taken it down when the store opened, thinking we'd made it, thinking he knew we'd made it together. But apparently he'd rewritten the beginning. I opened my old notebooks, the ones where I tracked every expense, drew layouts, scribbled marketing ideas. My name was in every margin. And suddenly, the silence around my role felt louder than anything he'd said. That night, I didn't cry. I felt something colder than sadness - clarity. He wanted a story that made him look strong, so he trimmed the truth until I disappeared. But I remembered. I had receipts, sketches, contracts I'd co-signed. I had photos not polished for social media, but real. Me standing in paint-stained jeans holding blueprints. Me carrying boxes late at night while he locked up. I'd been more than a helper. I'd been a builder. And builders don't vanish just because someone else wants the credit. I looked out the window and saw my reflection. I didn't look defeated. I looked awake. Maybe I wasn't done building. Maybe it was time to reclaim what I'd created. Not out of revenge, but out of self-respect. Because there's a difference between staying quiet to protect someone and staying silent while they bury you in their version of the truth. The next morning, I pulled out the manila folder labeled Launch Year from the drawer I hadn't touched in months. It was heavier than I remembered, not just with papers, but with the weight of everything I'd tucked away. Bank forms, with both our names, emails I'd printed when he couldn't figure out how to pitch to suppliers, where I'd stepped in and negotiated discounts myself. Even the initial lease had my signature in bold because, without my credit, the landlord wouldn't have taken the risk. I sat there for hours, sifting through timelines, photos, even handwritten notes where he thanked me for making this possible. It wasn't bitterness that guided MIT, was something sharper. I wanted to be seen again, not as a footnote, not as the woman in the background, but as the co-founder of the life he now claimed to have built alone. I made a copy of everything. I placed it neatly into a new folder, labeled with the store's name, Mandmine. I didn't know exactly what I'd do with it yet, but I wasn't going to let my role evaporate. I reached out to an old friend who now ran a local business blog. Just want to tell the real story? I wrote. I didn't know if she'd bite, but it felt like the first step in reclaiming my voice. Not to embarrass him, but to remember myself. The woman who walked into the bank alone and walked out carrying both debt and belief? If I stayed silent now, I'd be confirming his version, and I had too much proof and too much dignity for that later. That leak, my friend from the blog, replied. People need to hear this, she wrote. She invited me for coffee and brought along a small voice recorder and a notebook. I told her everything, how I mortgaged the house, signed the papers, filled the shelves when he panicked, and how I stayed quiet when he started calling it his store in front of others. Her eyes widened when I showed her the signed documents, the timeline, even the original sketches I had designed with color-coded tabs. Why didn't you say anything before? She asked softly. I shrugged, because I thought love meant letting him shine. And in that moment, I realized how much I had confused support with invisibility. I had allowed myself to vanish, thinking it was noble, but now, it just felt like betrayal of myself. The article went live 3 days later. It wasn't angry, it wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, respectful, and full of facts. The store behind the post. The headline read, and beneath it, my name, my photo, me, in front of the store, holding the blueprint we once dreamed over together. I didn't expect fireworks, but I also didn't expect the flood of messages. Old friends, former coworkers, even customers. I had no idea, one wrote. Thank you for telling your side. He didn't comment publicly, but I know he saw it because he took down the original post 2 hours after mine went live, and that silence. It spoke louder than anything he could have said. For days, I felt a strange mixture of relief and grief. Relief that the truth was finally out. Their grief that it had come to this. I hadn't wanted to expose anyone. I hadn't written to tear him down. I had simply reclaimed myself. But even in doing so, I knew I'd crossed a line in his eyes. One he believed only he was allowed to draw. He didn't call. He didn't message. He just let the silence fester, as if that would punish me. But I didn't feel small anymore. I felt solid. I walked past the store again the next morning. He was inside, rearranging a shelf. When our eyes met through the glass, he froze. Not in anger, more like recognition. For the first time in years, I think he saw me. Not the helper, not the assistant, but the architect of the very foundation he now stood on. I didn't go inside, I didn't wave. I just kept walking, heels clicking. With quiet certainty, outside, the world hadn't changed, but inside me, everything had. I was no longer asking for acknowledgement, I had claimed it. And maybe that's the most powerful kind of justice. The kind that doesn't scream, but simply stands. Steady, true. He could spin the story however he wanted, but the people who mattered had seen the real version now. And so had I. I went home, looked at the empty corners of the house I'd once risked, and whispered to myself, not out of regret, but out of pride, I built something real, even if it took losing him to finally see it. I started sewing again. It was something I hadn't done since the early days. Back when I used to patch together secondhand clothes to save money, back when every thread felt like defiance, the old machine still worked, humming softly beneath. My fingers as if it remembered. I didn't plan to sell anything. Not yet. But I needed to create something with my hands, something that was fully mine, untouched by borrowed credit or diluted gratitude. In the evenings, I stitched quietly. By the window, neighbors passed, the streetlights flickered on, and I felt grounded. For the first time in years, I wasn't trying to be part of someone else's dream. I was slowly reweaving my own. A quiet rebellion, dressed in fabric and thread. Something no headline or post could distort. People noticed. A woman from the community center asked me to teach a basic class on weekends. You've always had a gift, she said, smiling. I hesitated at first, unsure if I was ready to step into a room where I might be the center again, but I said yes. And the moment I stood before that little group of women and heard the familiar click of scissors and laughter over coffee, something shifted. They didn't know the whole story. They didn't need to. What they saw was a woman who showed up, who knew what she was doing, who could turn scraps into something beautiful. I didn't have to prove I belonged anymore. I just did. And in those quiet weekends, thread by thread, I began to mend something far more delicate than fabric. I was stitching myself back together. One Saturday, after class, a teenage girl lingered behind as the others left. She held up a half-finished apron with uneven seams and asked, "Is it okay if I mess up a little?" I smiled, gently took the fabric in my hands and replied, "Every masterpiece starts with crooked stitches." She grinned, and I saw in her eyes something I hadn't seen in mine for a long time, hope untainted by someone else's shadow. That afternoon, she stayed with me to practice, asking questions not just about sewing but about how I got started. I didn't give her the full story, but I told her enough that building something takes time, courage, and sometimes sacrifice that no one claps for. I saw her nod as if she understood, and for the first time, I felt like the years I'd spent in silence hadn't gone to waste. They had simply been seeds, buried deep, waiting to bloom in another way. That night, I sat by the same window where I'd sewn buttons onto his shirts, where I'd once calculated margins and supplier costs with a pen between my teeth. Now it was just me and a cup of tea. Warm light spilling over new fabric. I wasn't rushing anymore. I was choosing every color for myself. And as the neighborhood settled into sleep, I allowed a new thought to take shape. Maybe the legacy I leave won't be a store or a name on a lease. Maybe it'll be a girl who believes she can create something because someone once sat beside her and said, "Yes, you can." And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. By the end of the month, my little class had grown. Mothers, students, retirees all, bringing their own fabric, their own wounds, their own need to feel capable again. I never advertised it. I didn't post about it. And yet somehow, word spread. There was something sacred about the space we created together. No competition, no ego, no spotlight, just women helping women, thread by thread. I found myself laughing more, sleeping better, even humming again while washing dishes. The hurt hadn't disappeared, but it had softened. It had become a part of the stitching now, not the whole cloth. Every project I touched seemed to whisper, "You are more than what they chose to remember. You are what you chose to rebuild then." One afternoon I walked past the store again. A for sale sign hung in the window. He wasn't there. The glass had smudges. The flowers I used to arrange by the entrance were gone. It didn't sting the way I thought it would. It felt distant, like a place I once visited in another life. I paused only for a second, then kept walking. I had a class to teach, fabric to cut, stories to hear. The store was never the destination. It had just been one stop on my way back to myself. And as I crossed the street, I caught my reflection in a boutique window. I didn't look bitter or broken. I looked like a woman who had chosen her own story again and again. And that reflection, for the first time, I smiled at it, not out of vanity, but out of quiet, stubborn pride. The invitation came on thick, cream-colored paper, embossed and self-important. A gala, a fundraising event for local businesses. I read his name at the bottom of the host list and nearly dropped it in the recycling. But something made me stop. It wasn't bitterness. It wasn't revenge. It was a pull, a quiet voice inside that said, "You don't have to disappear to be dignified." I called the number on the card and RSVP'd. Yes. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't post a word. I just marked the date and went back to work. The week before the gala, I walked into the sewing room and pulled out a bolt of deep blue fabric I had been saving. It wasn't fancy, but it was rich and soft and mine. Every stitch I sewed felt like armor, like memory turned into elegance. I wasn't dressing to impress, I was dressing to remember. The night of the event, I arrived alone. No one rushed to greet me. No cameras clicked in my direction. And yet, the moment I stepped through the doors, I felt completely seen. By them, but by myself. I walked past him near the bar. He glanced over, then did a double take. I didn't stop. I didn't need to. The real stage wasn't the front of the room, it was every quiet choice I'd made to be there with my head high. I found my seat at the back, calmly tucked my clutch under the chair and waited, not for recognition, not for applause, just for the chance to look this night in the face and say I showed up anyway. An hour into the evening, they brought out the guest speakers. I listened, half detached, until a name made the room shift. Mine. I blinked, frozen for a moment as they invited me to the stage. He turned. Our eyes met, his full of confusion, mine calm as water. I stood slowly, not rushed, not surprised. The host announced my contribution to a new grant program for small local creators, funded in part by private donations. What they didn't say, but what he knew the moment I walked up, was that I had signed the contract authorizing that fund just a week before. A contract I'd waited to sign until this exact moment. I took the clipboard they handed me at the podium, clicked the pen with intention, and signed my name in silence while standing no more than 3 feet from the man who once claimed I was just the assistant. The room clapped politely. He didn't. He stood still, arms stiff at his sides, as if trying to understand what had just happened, but I didn't look back. I stepped off the stage with the same grace I had stitched into the hem of my dress. It wasn't about humiliating him. It wasn't about proving I was right. It was about reclaiming the truth in front of everyone who once looked through me. In that ballroom of high heels and darves, I didn't need to speak a word. My signature said it all, and I carried it with me like a torch through velvet and crystal, knowing I didn't take his spotlight. I simply lit my own. After the ceremony, I didn't linger. I thanked the organizers, picked up my coat, and walked out before the dancing began. Outside, the night was quiet, cool, honest. I stepped onto the sidewalk, heels clicking like punctuation behind every step. I didn't cry, I didn't smile. I just breathed, deeply. Fully. A car drove past slowly, music drifting out the window, something soft. Something I used to hum when folding invoices late at night. I paused under a street lamp, fingers brushing the edge of my clutch. Inside was a copy of the contract, stamped and sealed. Not for show, just for me. Proof that what I'd built with silent resilience had, in the end, spoken louder than any title ever could. I had outgrown the label he gave me. I wasn't just staff. I was the one who stayed, who built, who kept the lights on when no one clapped. And now, I was also the one who walked away on her own terms. As I reached the corner, someone from the event called my name. I turned slightly but didn't stop. They asked if I wanted a photo for the publication recap. I smiled faintly and shook my head. No need. I didn't need to be remembered by them. I already was, in the fabric of every woman I helped, in the grant I had signed, and most importantly, in the mirror I finally dared to meet without shame. That night wasn't a revenge, it was a release. And as I crossed the street toward home, I felt it for the first time in years. Not vindication, not victory, just peace. The kind you stitch for yourself. Quietly, carefully, forever. Weeks passed, the buzz from the gala died down. Articles were published, names were listed, and yet mine always came last if at all. That used to bother me, it doesn't anymore. Because every time I open the workshop now, I'm reminded of what truly matters. A teenager came in last Tuesday with a ripped backpack and eyes full of shame. I didn't ask questions. I just handed her a needle. 2 hours later, she left beaming, fixed bag in hand, a little straighter in posture, a little lighter in spirit. That's what recognition looks like to me. Not applause, not plaques, but small moments where someone feels seen because I chose to stay and make space for them. Funny how the woman labeled just the assistant became the one others now come to for guidance, for comfort, for courage stitched into fabric. One afternoon I heard he'd moved. Rumor had it his new venture didn't last. But I didn't search for details. I didn't chase gossip. I simply placed a set of new order slips on the shelf and continued pinning a pattern in silence. Life has a way of sorting itself when we stop shouting and start listening to ourselves, to the quiet truths that never needed microphones. I no longer carry the weight of what he said. That phrase, just the assistant, it shrank. Not because I proved him wrong, but because I no longer needed him to be wrong for me to feel right. The role I played wasn't small. It was steady, foundational, and in the world I've built, that's more than enough. A few days ago, I received a letter. Handwritten, unfamiliar script. Inside was a short note from one of the young designers the grant had supported. She said she'd seen me that night in the audience and didn't know who I was until weeks later. "You didn't look like someone waiting to be noticed," she wrote. "You looked like someone who already knew who she was." I held that letter for a long time, not because I needed validation, but because it reminded me of the quiet ripple. Effective dignity. I had spent years thinking my worth depended on being named, elevated, spotlighted, but it turns out worth is something that builds inside you when you choose to stay rooted while the world tries to forget you. That night, with the contract, the dress, and the silence, I didn't change the narrative to punish anyone. I rewrote it so someone else wouldn't have to feel what I once did. That letter now rests in the same drawer as the contract. Not displayed, just kept, a reminder that, even after everything, I still believe in doing the work quietly, showing up fully, and leaving rooms with my head high even if no one claps. Especially then, what I built was not a stage. It was a foundation. And those who walk it, now those who rise from it, will never have to question if their story matters. Because someone like me stayed in the background long enough to hold it steady and then finally to let go. There's something poetic about the way closure doesn't arrive with fireworks, but with a deep breath and a door that no longer creaks when you walk past it. I visit the space we once shared only in memory now. Not out of bitterness, but clarity. I gave, I stayed, I sacrificed, and he couldn't see it. That says more about his blindness than my light. People often ask if I regret funding his rise. If I would do it differently, and the truth is maybe, but not out of resentment, just out of self-respect. Still, I know the woman I was then did what she could with what she knew. She believed, trusted, hoped, and that woman deserves kindness from the woman I am now. So I don't shame her, I thank her. Because without her, I wouldn't be standing here, whole, unshaken, free. Sometimes I walk past shop windows that remind me of our old plans. I see a man speaking into a microphone on TV and feel the echo of that moment when he said, "I owe nothing to her." But that echo fades. Because now, I don't need to be owed anything. I don't live in debt, not emotional, not financial, not spiritual. I paid the price. I wrote the checks. I stitched the silence. And I walked away with something far more valuable than credit: integrity. So let them write their stories. Let them host their parties and claim their crowns. I'll be here still building, still choosing softness without surrender, still showing up. And if someone asks where it all began, I'll smile. Because I'll know. It began with me, quiet, overlooked, and unstoppable.